thank you for the introduction. That was fantastic. One of those scenarios where I've never actually felt really, really old, but when I start laying it out linearly, it kind of freaks me out, actually. I'm thrilled beyond belief to be here myself because, first of all, Nick Mason is obviously a great band. He's with a great band. He's a great drummer, but he's a guy that actually was inspirational for me when I was a little jerk about 14 years old to get in a band, and we actually called ourselves the Intergalactic Space Force because I was so hung up on the back cover of Umaguma, in which the dude basically laid out every possible, percussion instrument there could be. I just stared and stared and stared at it. So, without much further ado, he's here. One of the reasons he's here, of course, is because Pink Floyd will soon be releasing, actually next week, a massive amount of their catalog in newly refurbished editions. They're going to be great. From what I've seen, it looks like any Pink Floyd fan's dream. And we spoke a couple of months ago, had a great time doing that, and I think you're going to find him a great guy, a funny guy, and a very sort of a rewarding listen by any means. So I will ask Nick to come on up and let us proceed. Mr. Mason. It is indeed hard to believe that you're here. It's so good to see you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Nick, one of the last times I saw you, it was at Capitol Records. You were basically being part of the announcement of these reissues. And you said a few words, and one of the things you said that I thought was absolutely fascinating as a consumer was this. You mentioned that one of the things that you found compelling about these reissues was the fact that now more than ever it seemed like you wouldn't use the words the last chance, but it seemed like with music being sold digitally these days and the lack of people like me looking at Umaguma covers because it's hard to buy them anymore literally in vinyl, that this might be kind of one of the last shebang, so to speak, of great physical product and that sort of thing. And I mean, I know you're intensely aware of that sort of thing. So what's your take overall on, does that make sense to you? Like, what does this mean in terms of physical product in Pink Floyd's catalog? What's the oomph for you there?
Well, I think I did say that I thought it was the sort of last gasp of physical records, and I think that may well be the case. I can't see us going back to that sort of system. I think it will be downloading forevermore. But I think I'm beginning to feel a little more positive about this the whole downloading business taking over, because I think initially I was disappointed at the thought that all that great artwork would sort of disappear and there'd be no more of it. And all the things Storm had done over the years for us, but all the other artists who'd worked on those sort of, on those sleeves and covers and books and so on. But the reality is that in many ways, the CD booklet is a very disappointing piece of stuff. What I really like is a proper vinyl cover. You can get it out. It's just, the line I've used is, I've said it's a little bit like the Japanese tea ceremony. It's the whole thing, taking the record out, getting sure there's no dust on it, putting it on, all the rest of it, and then you roll a big spliff on the... the whole thing's complete. But obviously, in the 21st century, that isn't the acceptable behaviour. But I think the reason I'm feeling sort of a bit more positive about it was that in fact, on the flight over, someone showed me the sort of download that comes with the Bjork album. And of course, this could be a fantastic future for add-ons to music. And I suspect, in fact, what will happen is we'll actually have really great visuals that will be done to come with virtually any music you choose. And we'll just have the big screen somewhere. And we'll move on like that. And of course, hopefully, if there's a big screen, there's a fair chance that everyone will then have some decent speakers. There is something a little disappointing about the business of going to all that trouble to make all these fantastic, clean-sounding records, and then see everyone listening to them with these little things in their ears.
That's great. Well, in the course of actually examining your catalog thoroughly, it must have been an opportunity for you on a business level to re-listen to a lot of the stuff that you've done, maybe just to hear if everything sounded right. And I would imagine that since you participated in all those recordings, it wasn't something you'd like to do or had done much in the past, so to speak. So did the re-listening, so to speak, that you did that bring any kind of like, new notions about what you did? Was it inspiring? Was it a drag, etc.?
Not a drag, but I have to say I tend to listen to old material critically, and critically of the drums in particular. I'm usually perfectly happy with what David, Roger and Rick did, but I do tend to listen and think, God, did I do that? Why did I do that? Why did I do it that way? And it's interesting because that's the major part. But every now and again there's something where you listen and you go, now that was good. That really works. And sometimes I think particularly the sort of construction, the overall construction of the record, sometimes you forget how it worked because you do tend to, all too often you hear one of the tracks on the radio or something, you very rarely do listen to say Dark Side or Wish You Were Here or anything as a complete piece.
I remember when I saw Pink Floyd play in Detroit at Cobo Arena for the Dark Side tour. I was very happy to have seen that. And I remember before that, one of my stereophile friends, we grabbed a Maguma, and back pre-quad even, there was this whole notion that if you took like the right and left output and added a third thing that combined both of those into a third speaker, you'd have like really ultra primitive quad before they called it quad. And I bring that up because people back then were trying to like get the most out of your records, and they thought there were things that were put in the records that were there for them to hear. So I guess the question is sort of with that in mind, did you wish when you heard some of this stuff again that you had the current technology available to you, or do you think that you were pretty ahead of your time in that regard as far as placements of sounds, etc.?
I'm not sure that we were ahead of the time, but I think the last thing we would wish in general is to have the technology that's available now, then, because we'd still be working on Dark Side, if that was the case. There is a big problem with modern technology in that you can save making any decision until right at the end of the record. So consequently, you'll spend so long on the mixing. It's, in a way, I think better to, in many cases, to get on and get records made rather than agonize for too long over it. And that for me is the reason I'd say I don't hanker after new technology in those days. Also, in general, I'm really happy with the sound quality of the early records. It would have been nice to have recorded certainly the earliest stuff in stereo rather than mono. Mm-hmm. But apart from that, no, I'd try and avoid all that digital wizardry.
So now I want to ask you to put your ego on hold for a second and kind of think about the stuff you did from a purely critical perspective, if it's possible. You guys played a lot live. I've heard a lot of the tapes that are out there, et cetera. You were marvelous. None of those sets really ever sounded the same, which was interesting because you could improvise, and you often did. So with that in mind, when you hear what you did, or representations of what you did, do you feel like you were an extraordinarily good band, or do you feel like you were kind of sloppy and undisciplined sometimes and the records kind of caught you on good days? What's your take on how you were as a live proposition back, like, let's say, the early 70s?
Gifted amateurs. No, I think... what to say about that? I think it's different members of the band, but certainly from my point of view, I'm sort of very conscious really now about how, yes, people say, when did you start playing the drums? And I say, 13, 14, whatever. But what I did was I just messed around a bit from when I was 13 or 14. I didn't actually start playing seriously until we actually were in a working band. Whereas, one of the things that came over rather clearly to me a year ago was I was asked to help judge the Young Drummer of the Year competition. And I sat there as this kid played. And I was sitting with a bunch of Ian Pace and Carl Brazil and 2 or 3 other really great drummers. And we watched this kid and we looked at each other and went, how does he do that? it was absolutely mind-boggling how good the playing was. And, you listen to how you played 20 years ago or something, and it's difficult not to feel, really.
Very good. I think a lot of us who are long-term fans were really excited, and although we couldn't be at the show, seeing the photos, I think, of Roger's tour in England, in which both you and David and he were just on the stage at the same time, and that sort of thing. That was an inspiring thing to see for all of us that liked you very much. It just brings to mind all the history. There's a lot of history between the members of Pink Floyd, this and that, and the notion of all of you being in the same place at the same time, for somebody who really follows the band and likes you guys very much, is interesting as can be. So with that in mind, clearly in putting all of these records together again, you guys either were in the same room or had to have some discussions for the first time in a long time about let's do this, let's do that. What was the interactive process like for you three figuring out what this was going to be all about?
Well, it was very civilized and actually quite easy, but actually we didn't spend lots of time in the same place. It tended to be a matter of James or Andy, James Guthrie or Andy Jackson, working on sections and then sending them to all of us and then us all giving feedback. There were almost no disagreements, I'd say, about that. It worked really well. We tended to have very specific criticisms, and it would tend to be something that we wouldn't necessarily agree on it. It would just be one person's view of something, and James would generally take account of that and maybe do a remix and sort of change something. But there were no real sort of, I don't like that, and you can't possibly do it like that or anything.
That's interesting.
I might just say something about the night of playing at the O2, because it was actually a really good evening. And for me, it was really quite interesting, because, of course, it was the first time I've ever sat in the audience and seen David Roger on stage. And it was I have to say it was a golden moment, because there was... Dave played Comfortably Numb on Comfortably Numb and appeared at the top of the wall. The interesting thing was that the light sort of hit him, and it was most of the people there. There'd been talk about whether Dave might play at some point or whatever, but it was astonishing how the whole room got it immediately and realised it was David up there and not Snowy or whoever normally does the part. And I really loved it. It reminded me of sort of how important the band is, and how the band does have this sort of special thing in people's hearts, really. And it was a perfect evening for me as well, because I sat through the entire show and then finally went on the end, tapped a tambourine, and everyone waved and shouted. And I thought, that's the career I'm looking for.
That's good. Just a few more questions about you guys and your respective opinions about the record you made, because everybody here is obviously a huge fan of everything you've done. All of us, I'm sure, have our own unique favorites, different phases of the band, that sort of thing. Do you find that when you must talk about what's the most important and most relevant Pink Floyd projects, you all tend to agree? Like, do all of you, for example, think that Dark Side was really it? Do you, for example, think, no, Metal was my favorite, everything after that was blah, blah, blah? I mean, you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think, well, I suppose the best thing would be to suggest it's a little bit, each album is like one of your children, and you tend to, you have affection and rage. I I was going to say in equal parts, but that's not true for children anyway. There's such sort of markers in your life, really. So you have, and so the album is not only about the music, it's also about what was going on in your life at the time. So a favourite album might be, an earlier one, or it might be, for me, actually the last one, Division Bell, because I really just loved the touring that we did with those last two albums. I think more than albums, it tends to be tracks as well, because that becomes not so much about the album, but whether you play it live, and if you've got favourite songs to play live, that also tends to be sort of almost more important than the album.
Is there like any particular moment, say, that you can say this was us at our peak, this is us at our peak? I mean, is there like something that just kind of sends shivers that you can't believe you're fortunate enough to participate in?
No, because I think there were various different stages, really. I think there were, almost working through the albums, there were moments when doing Piper at the Gates of Dawn, where you're actually suddenly thinking, we are in EMI, we are, the Beatles are down the hall, we're doing this, you suddenly felt like you were professional, and that's, that for the music industry is quite a sort of golden moment. But then there were moments doing Saucer where, again, we would sort of re-energise really after the sort of really the real difficulties of Sid and Sid leaving and the sort of pain that there'd been really trying to work with Sid when he didn't really want to be there. Refinding ourselves and recording Saucer from that point of view was absolutely terrific, and really working together on particularly something like the title track, which was, Roger and I were sketching out how we thought the thing should go, and Rick was working on the Rats and the piano section, and so that was great. Dark Side, again, pretty good in terms of working together. And something like Wish You Were Here. The great thing with that was finally actually getting an album completed, because it had been such a struggle, and we'd worked our way through the sort of non-event of the Household Objects project and things like that. As I say, each one's sort of different and has elements to it that you remember affectionately.
Well, the Household Objects thing is an interesting point in that we remember, if we're fans, what that was supposed to be. And in this world of reissues and box sets and newly digitized versions, you always think, oh great, here come a bunch of unreleased tracks and that sort of thing. Was Pink Floyd the type of band that it actually had a lot of unreleased material to put out, if you know what I mean? And with that in mind, how do these new reissues kind of deal with that?
Well, in a way it's a problem, because it would have been great if we had got lots of unreleased material. But the reality was that we were quite rather good at housekeeping. If we didn't use it on one record, we'd use it on the next. And the things that, the only things that were left sort of in the vaults or in general were things that we were just deeply ashamed of and just didn't actually want to ever see the light of day. And so, unfortunately, I mean, it would have been great to have had all sorts of things to bring out, but we just don't. We didn't. I think, well, every scrap of Dark Side of the Moon is now available in the new immersion version, and I sort of wish to be able to promise everyone that we will never release yet another version of it after this. That would be it. I do apologise if I find myself up here in 3 years' time going.
That's great. Yeah, it's funny because I know that the first two Floyd albums came out in mono versions, and the fans grabbed those right away. But I don't really hear too much hubbub. Maybe I'm completely out of it about a mono version of Dark Side. Does it exist? Well,
it was worth talking about doing a complete set of 78s.
Very good. But along the same lines, is there one thing? I mean, it's sort of like a bastard child recording that never really found home, but now finally might see the light of day that you feel good about now with these reissues, et cetera?
Well, I think there's something like the '74 Wembley show, which wouldn't have seen the light of day in a previous world, simply because we've been able to use modern technology to clean it up and make it good enough. So I suppose that would qualify as something like that. I mean, the specific example on that is that there was a faulty, as far as I remember, there was a faulty microphone on one of the bass drums, and so it was either cutting out or making weird noises or doing something horrid. And so, but that's the sort of thing that we could repair with digital technology, and we couldn't have done that before digital music.
You mentioned before the early days of being in, I guess, Abbey Road Studios, or at least saying, I can't believe we're in EMI, and Sid. And now Sid is obviously a massive figure in the band's history, and has not been represented too well in terms of their overall catalog, just because of the way things worked out. As a friend of his, someone who's had known him for years, is there an aspect, especially of him, that you know, knowing him very well, that the recordings themselves perhaps haven't really illustrated, if you know what I mean? In other words, most people that know Syd Barrett know the Pink Floyd records that he's on, the solo albums, and not much more but the mythology. But you're a friend. I mean, is there anything you can tell us that might be enlightening here?
Well, I think in many ways I'd say that the music expresses an awful lot of Sid and a lot of the qualities. I mean, the sort of saddest thing about it was that when I first knew Sid, and I have to say I was not as close to Sid as the others, because particularly Roger and David had been childhood friends, and I wasn't at all. I only met Sid when he came up to London to go to Camberwell Art School. But he was such an outgoing, such a easy guy to get on with when I first met him, and that's one of the saddest things. I mean, well, frankly, Roger, from the moment I met Roger, was always a very, very difficult person, and he does claim he's mellowed, but this is still under debate. So Sid's music, there's the sort of Wistful to Gnome and Bike and so on. And then I think the really sad Jug Band Blues from Saucer, which is really his sort of farewell. As I say, in terms of, it's a really sad story in a way, because it is about someone having a breakdown. And I mean, I've talked about this a lot in the past, but I think we still live with a bit of guilt about it all, because I think, being wise after the event, we should have comprehended what was going on and realised that actually Sid was really unhappy being in a commercial band, and really this was not the way he wanted to go. And I'm not sure it would have changed anything, but it would have probably made his life easier, well, and ours.
Actually, related to that, when we last spoke, I asked you this because this was like one of those things I always wanted to ask somebody like this. I think I was like in 9th grade or 7th. No, obviously I was really young. I had a paper route. They were in America. They were playing an afternoon TV show hosted by Pat Boone, the Pat Boone Show. Okay, this is true. And then, that I was like a little kid, and they had H.P. Lovecraft the week before. I said, "This is great. These bands are on TV. How?" Because the radio never played them. So I got my chance to see Pink Floyd. And, I was really saying, oh my God, look at this. So what I remember, and the reason I bring this up is Pat Boone, we know Pat Boone, right? He's the nicest guy in the world. And what he would do is when the band played, when it was over, he'd come up and talk to the band. And there at the microphone was Sid. And I do remember that he went up to Sid and asked him like a normal, genial Pat Boone kind of question. And I'm not going to, now you were there. Sid just stared at him and didn't answer, and there was like dead air. And then he asked him another question, and there was more dead air. And I was like going, "This is great." So what happened there? And then tell me how that works.
Yeah, it was pretty well as described. It was truly frightening, because everyone saw Pat advancing on us, and there was a real shuffle to try and get Roger in front of Sid. So but of course, Pat had sort of seen that Sid was the singer, so that's who he was going to talk to. And Sid did finally say something. I can't remember for the life of me what he said, but it was something that was fine. But it was okay. And then, in fact, what happened was that in the great tradition of American sort of talk shows, all the other guests immediately sensed that there was an opening for them to get something out. Was it George Jessel who was on the show? But they all realised that there was a gap and they could fill it.
That's great. Well, thank you for clearing that up. That was always really good. It's funny what stays with you over the years. Going back to the dark side, which you've already kind of made reference to as like how many times we'll be back about that. But because of that very fact, because of the fact that most people that really like that record like it so much they own it in a variety of configurations and that sort of thing, what I would ask is, when you made that record, did you even have an inkling that it was anything other than just the next step in Pink Floyd's making records? Did it mean anything special to you at the time?
I think the answer is that we knew we'd made the best record so far. We were conscious of the fact that this was a step forward, that it was much more sophisticated. The fact that the way it was constructed, there'd been a lot of thought into making it. And, it was an early concept album, and so that was very relevant. The way it was sort of cross-faded and linked and so on was it felt quite sophisticated. Having said that, I don't think any artist in his right mind you, there aren't very many who are in their right mind, but if we accept that, would be able to say this album is going to be a hit. You make the album for yourself, really, and then you hope to hell that the public will like it and the record company will get behind it. So there is no guarantee, however brilliant you think you are, that record will sell. So we certainly had no idea that it was going to be that successful. And of course, no one in a million years would have dreamt that the record was going to be on the Billboard charts for 1,000 weeks or whatever it is, because that hadn't happened. That would have been trying to, in the 15th century, work out that electricity was going to be invented. It's a sort of some way on.
Very good. So that album, its cover is iconic. There are records out. There's the Dub Side of the Moon. There's a whole bunch of things related to that record. It's become so much part of culture. There's Lazarium shows that make lots of money every week, I'm sure. I hope you get some. Basically, okay, playing that. There's the famous, and I can't believe I'm even asking this, but you're here, so I'm going to ask you. The famous thing about the Wizard of Oz and and putting the Dark Side of the Moon on simultaneously, right? I mean, okay. I'm not going to ask you, is that true or not? Okay.
I'm prepared to sit here and make some incredible invented story about Judy Garland being in the studio with us and, singing the songs. And then we had the Tin Man, and then there was the Lion, and,
but my question is, what is it? Why did that take over everyone's consciousness for like 20 years?
Because some maniac somewhere sat down and, are we talking about the Wizard of Oz, some maniac must have fiddled around with the soundtrack and the film and thought, this sort of works. But having said that, there is no doubt that one of the extraordinary things is if you feed someone some visual imagery and play them some music, you can really lock the thing on. And it's really amazing. You can take what would appear to be the most unrelated piece of film and play some piece of music to it. Once you've seen it, very hard to put other music against it. One of the worst things about doing film scores is that the director will almost certainly have been running the film with some piece of music that he likes before you get a chance to work on it. And forever after, he's always going, well, can you make it a bit more like whatever it was that was playing there? It's really difficult. It just locks in so quickly.
It's interesting. I do remember seeing a few Pink Floyd shows where you obviously had movies playing like this, and now I'm confused whether this was a Floyd show or a Roger show. There was some movie, Welcome to Blood City. I don't know if it was some Western that was futuristic. But the point of it all is, you're quite right about it locking in the visual imagery from that point forward. And I mean, it's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like music videos for that very reason when you get down to it. The fact
that... I mean, because there's certainly that thing about a piece of music being something where you can use your imagination and draw your own conclusions and paint your own pictures in your mind. I mean, the ultimate piece of music and film is The Sorcerer's Apprentice. I imagine you've all seen it, but those brooms have ruined so much music for some people.
That's good. Well, so now that record became the phenomenon it was, and it was a turning point on lots of different levels. And that happened, and now when people talk about you, they talk about you being a famous drummer and a guy that owns 40 incredibly expensive cars. I mean, life changed, and I don't mean that in a capitalistic way, but what I mean is that things had to have changed internally. From a career standpoint, you probably said, let's take a while before we put out a new record because we've got a lot to promote. Maybe you didn't hang out with each other as much as you used to because you didn't need to, because you're buying estates off who knows where, et cetera, maybe not. But tell me, in day-to-day terms, how did things change for you right during that period and after it became a success? How did things really change?
Well, it didn't change that quickly, of course, because actually, while Dark Side was sort of beginning to really go up the charts, we were actually touring in America. And you're much more involved in the touring than you are. Someone comes up and says, hey, great news, your album's #1. You go, that's terrific, but we're off to Dallas tomorrow. And, and schedule rather than in the private jet. So actually that takes up a certain amount of sort of working time. But of course the other thing is, it's of course money changes things, changes lifestyle and all the rest of it. But actually it's probably secondary to the fact that we were all growing older and growing up. And so by the time Dark Side came along, most of us were married and most of us we had children. I tell you, children do change your life in a way that money doesn't. Anyway, I'm not talking about parenting tonight. We're going to move on.
Okay. So I now go forward in time to another time I saw you, and I was very happy to be able to see this. This was at the Nassau Coliseum in New York when you did a performance of The Wall out there, and that was wonderful to see. And in the course of, say, Dark Side and the records that came between that and The Wall, much as I love The Wall, and I still think it's a fantastic Pink Floyd record, if I would play those back and forth, I think this sounds like a great rock band playing great rock music. The Wall, I think this is a fantastic record. It's almost like music theater, or it's a theater presentation. You're a drummer, you probably never played the same notes twice and stuff like that, but I wouldn't be surprised on a record like that, towards that phase of the band's career, you kind of really had to try to do that nearly all the time to keep time and stuff like that. So did you feel that too, and was that something that you didn't care about, didn't like, etc.?
Well, you're quite right. The drumming on The Wall is very much more specific and sort of constrained in terms of needing to be played in a very almost the same way all the time. I don't know if how many of you have seen Roger's Wall show, but good, very good. Well done. I'll take the names of anyone who didn't put their hand up. And tell Roger, then you'll be in trouble. What was interesting was he'd taken the record as the sort of blueprint for it, which well, I'll see him next week. I was going to ask him about it because I think if I'd got Graham Broad playing drums for me, I'd probably let Graham sort of do, modify the parts slightly in terms of some of the fills, but he actually stuck very, very accurately to the record. In fact, I really quite enjoyed it because in a way it's another discipline, and I quite like that thing of, sometimes playing in a much freer style and sometimes having to do it and get it absolutely right. And certainly on other occasions when I've worked with other people, I really quite like that thing of where maybe the music does need to be very specific and very accurate. I mean, you're absolutely right. It is a sort of musical show rather than sort of. It has well, Roger's version has no freedom in it because everything now has the technology to keep it right. I mean, when we originally did the show in '79, we actually had to build in little sections because, of course, what would happen is there'd be a problem with the wall building, and suddenly we needed, another. Well, it's going to take another 30 seconds, so we're going to have to do another 8 or 16 bars or whatever. And so we'd just have bits of music that would just get slotted in to carry it along.
I remember, speaking of technology, the time I saw you on the Dark Side tour in Detroit. I guess during the performance of Careful with That Axe, Eugene, there's that climactic point where, and I think back then, this is going back to, 73 or 72, whatever, there used to be an early effect of explosions on stage. And in Detroit, this is no lie, this is so weird, there was an issue because apparently there was a double load placed because one of your road crew did the wrong thing and that sort of thing. Okay, and a lot of us in the audience who were very young and in college and were like a lot of Pink Floyd's fans of the early 70s, if you catch my drift, we're sitting there going, this is great. And all of a sudden the explosion happened and we were saying, that was like really loud, dudes. Okay. So the point is, I would imagine there were gaffes on occasion, like I think that was a gaffe. I hope it was, or else, or the wall thing that you mentioned before. That was an incredibly high-level technology type show for 1979. I mean,
yeah. Well, it's an interesting example, that one, because there's a big difference. The wall, putting an extra 8 bars in is one thing. What happened at the Cobo Hall was unbelievable. It wasn't a road crew's fault, actually. What had happened was there was a bin which had a flash pot in it. And the bin was held down with a stage weight, which is a piece of iron, really. And the flash pot went off on cue and superheated the stage weight, which had an air bubble in it. So this thing went off like a bomb. I mean, it was unbelievable. And bits of shrapnel flew around the auditorium. And there was one guy, I think there was someone in the front seat who caught one of these pieces of metal. He was okay, but because he was back for the second half. But it was shattering. I mean, we all were there. First of all, none of us could hear anything after that, so we were looking at each other, trying to work out what had happened. And it had also blown out nearly all the speakers on stage. So there was just a lot of sort of hissing and crackling and so on. That was a big one.
Well, you should take comfort that all of us said to each other on the way out, that was the best show I've ever seen in my life.
Well, and I think we came off stage going, I think we got away with it.
Okay. Moving on. One of the highlights of the new reissues is the great version of Wish You Were Here, which actually features the famed French violinist Stéphane Grappelli and that sort of thing. That's not something I think most of us would have thought would even happen, that you might be in a studio with someone like that. Tell us a bit about that and how that took place. Okay,
well, this, I have to say, there'll be a few people who've maybe heard this story before, because in some ways this is my favourite item that has come out of this whole enterprise. And this was, while we were recording Wish You Were Here, we were in Studio 3 in Abbey Road, and Yehudi Menuhin and Stefan were working on an album. And I actually went to the trouble of finding out what the album was that they were working on. I, of course, can't remember now. But and in sort of the tradition, really, of Abbey Road, people sort of wandered in and out of each other's studios and came and said hello and so on. And Yehudi and Stefan were brought in to say hello, and someone was, had the courage really to suggest that they play on the record. And for Stefan, it was really easy because he's an improviser, a jazz violin player. For anyone who doesn't know, worked a lot with a French guitar player called Django Reinhardt. Unfortunately, Yehudi Menuhin, there is this problem quite often with classically trained players that they find it really, really difficult to improvise. And so Yehudi wouldn't play on it. I think he just felt he couldn't do it. But Stefan played, and it's a really charming piece. I think it sounds terrific, and I'm still puzzling in a way as to why we didn't use it originally, because I think it sits really, really well with the music.
So one of the things that one would note as a fan is that in the ongoing reissue program that EMI is doing here, there are I think 3 albums that are being selected for incredibly special treatment. One's Dark Side, one's Wish You Were Here, and one's The Wall, if I'm not forgetting one. Okay. They come in various versions, immersion versions. They're kind of incredible. If you're a fan, I mean, people would want them. They're really good. They're not excessive, I think, in terms of like offering something for fans. Is it just something as simple as those 3 because they sold the most? I don't know that they did. Or I mean, like, did the public's taste for what constituted a great Pink Floyd album coincide with Pink Floyd's idea of what was a great Pink Floyd record?
I think it's a sort of combination, really, that they're always seen as the most important, most successful albums. The fact of the matter is that looked like the best place to start because of that. I mean, if people really like them, it'd be great to do, maybe not Piper on its own, maybe we do the early albums in an immersion version with some more detail. We certainly have got a few demos that, in fact, I think that I've kept that were of the band before we signed with EMI. We did 4 or 5 tracks that were done at a studio somewhere in, I think, it's in North London. We used them as sort of demos for things like, Battle of the Bands type contests, all of which we lost horribly. But they've lasted quite well. They've Syd Barrett songs and 2 or 3 Syd songs and a sort of blues thing as well. And it'd be nice, fun to put some of those sorts of things out. And as I say, I think they might not justify a sort of 5-album set on the first one, but we could combine maybe all the early 2 or 3 early records and see what else we could find to go with them.
So now I've been told that within the next week or so, and this is really fortunate for you guys, that I think you're on the cover of Rolling Stone, and there's a big story about Pink Floyd, and it's fantastic, and it's just one of the many, many times that you've been in the public eye. There's books out there, including one that you've written, and he's going to sign afterwards. But you've been so written about and historicized, even if you don't want to read it because it drives you crazy, is there anything that people haven't gotten properly about Pink Floyd, if you know what I mean? In other words, is there an aspect that continues to be misunderstood, that you don't care too much, but it still sort of bugs you that people think that this happened or that happened?
I don't think so. I mean, I think you're right. We've sort of been through a lot of press and a lot of writing and so on. I mean, eventually you begin to feel like a sort of stately home. Visitors walking around you. It's a curious thing. I don't think so. I mean, I think we didn't. I suppose certainly for a long time, I think we did rather minimal press and PR, and I think that was the right thing to do. And I don't think, at the end of the day, it all stands or falls on the music. And do any of us feel deeply misunderstood by you lot? I don't think so. I think I have no special message to bring you, Earthlings.
Okay. Nick, just a few more questions before we turn it over to some audience questions. Something I didn't ask you that I wouldn't mind hearing you speak of for a minute, and that is, you obviously, I don't want to say you had any free time to speak of at all, but like you did some interesting stuff that was not Pink Floyd related, that involved producing an interesting array of albums. Like one of my all-time favorite albums is Robert Wyatt's Rock Bottom. Produced that, it's a masterpiece, it's fantastic. Then you went, I mean, I'm probably missing something, but then you produced a record by The Damned, not exactly what you think of when you think of Pink Floyd or Robert Wyatt, for that matter. You've made a record, Fictitious Sports, which is with Carla Bley and Terry Adams, a great record. Okay, thank you. It's a great record. And then additionally, you did a record with, is it Rick Fenn or something like that? Fictitious. Okay. Anyway, the point is, you did a lot of those things. What did those things offer you? Why did you do them? I mean, that's an interesting phase, and nobody really gets a chance to talk to you about those.
I think almost anyway. In some ways, I've had a rather sort of sheltered life. You know, being in one band for 40 odd years, there's a limit to how broad that is. And I think if you are, you know, if you're a musician, one of the great things is to be able to work with other people and learn more. And from that point of view, in terms of production, I absolutely loved all the records I made. I mean, the Robert one was probably my favourite because I'm very fond of Robert anyway, and the way the record turned out, I was really proud of, and it was an opportunity to work with a whole load of musicians who I ended up, in some cases, working with again. But The Damned, which was an extraordinary record in a way, because what actually happened there was that The Damned had approached our publishers to see if they could get Sid Barrett to be their producer, which would have been really quite exciting. And that was out of the question, so I got asked if I'd do it. And I learned a lot and I enjoyed doing it. I think unfortunately, The Damned don't feel the same way, because they were in the middle of having their musical differences. And really, I mean, so I was actually trying to produce two bands at once, you know, where half of them wanted to do one thing. Dave Vanian and Brian wanted to do one thing, and Rat and the captain wanted to do something entirely different. So it was not an easy period, but at least it didn't last very long. You know, the great thing with them was, you know, I can remember saying to the captain after he'd done 2 takes of something, saying, "It's good. You know, do you want to run it again?" And he went, "Nah, that'll do."
That's
and
great.
you know, you have to go, "Yeah, okay, then let's move on."
Okay, so now wrapping up with the Floyd aspect here. If you're having dinner with someone that you know, and the conversation gets a little loose, and somebody, I doubt they would, but if they casually employed the cliche of the glory days of your life, the Pink Floyd's glory days and stuff like that, that's a kind of a loaded term in and of itself. But if someone did say that, when would that be?
Well, I think it comes back to the sort of, you know, when, which period did I like best or whatever. The answer is there isn't a clear designation, you know, because again, just that whole thing in the very first year of the first year with Glory Days in a way, because suddenly this I can't overemphasize how special it was to be a working band and to actually have people paying you to play, even if they sometimes didn't like it. I mean, it was, which did happen. That was really special. But then, right at the other end, there were the stuff, the Division Bell, and the tours with Dave, which were terrific because of the opportunity to play enough to get better. I mean, for the show to get better. And you know, the big regret I say big regret. When I look back, I think what's a real shame is that we didn't tour things like Dark Side for longer. I mean, being in hindsight, what would have been great would have been when Dark Side was released, we should have taken the next year just to tour the show. But we were so it was understood that what you did was you went back into the studio and made the next record. Well, actually, we hadn't got anything ready to go. We should have just said, no, we're not. We're going to take a year off and play some more. And I think we'd have then, when I say developed, I think we'd have developed the show further, which would have been a nice thing to do, and hopefully would have filmed it, which, you know, one of the great regrets now is we have no film of any of the Dark Side shows. At the time, they were fairly groundbreaking. we had crashing planes and lasers and film and all the rest of it.
Loud
And I'd
explosions
love
on
to have
stage.
lived it now.
Some loud explosions on stage.
Loud explosions.
Go ahead.
Bang.
Anyway, the last question I'll ask you is one that I'm sure everyone wants to know the answer to, and I'm sure you get asked this nearly every day by people that you don't know, and is what is the status of Pink Floyd at this very moment?
Well, it's dysfunctional. There are no plans to do anything. I mean, and I have to be very careful with this because at the back of my mind is the possibility that maybe we could do another, a sort of development of Live Aid, really. But I think the one thing that might make it happen would be to do something, as with Live Aid, that you do something for the right reasons. I don't think we'd work together again for money. David, when he's asked, he goes, no way, never, wouldn't do it. But that's what he was saying before Live Aid. So you never know. But my sort of, I suppose, what I would like would be to find that we would do something. I don't think we'd ever go back in the studios, but I think we would play live for the right reasons. If we could do something truly worthwhile, and we could do that other people couldn't for some reason, then I'd hope we'd sort of rise to the occasion.
That sounds great. Well, I'm sure that all of us are, on the basis of these new releases, going to be listening to all the recordings, and it's been an impressive array. And maybe if you don't go back to the studio, you got nothing to lose, right? You won't make a bad one, which is fantastic. Why don't we now? I'm sure there's some questions to be had here. Let's see. I want to go first with the guy behind the guy in the white shirt, because his was the first hand I saw. So could you stand up maybe and say your question?
Mr. Mason, I just want to say, it's a great joy to see you and hear your words after what seems like quite a long time since you were here in Los Angeles with Roger at the Hollywood Bowl. My question is, following the Live Aid performance, the reunion, long-awaited reunion that thrilled fans worldwide, yourself, Mr. Waters, Gilmore, and Wright, you did a handful of shows with Mr. Waters. Mr. Gilmore and Wright did their On Island tour together, but I hadn't heard of any further collaboration between you and Mr. Wright. And I was wondering if, and I apologize if this is a delicate question, but if you had any studio time together or had a live performance following Live Aid with Mr. Wright?
I think the answer is I did a show with Dave and Rick at the Albert Hall, I think, when he was doing his On an Island tour. So the answer is yes, I've done a little bit with Dave and Rick when they were together. But of course, with the sad passing of Rick, I mean, we're not going to get back there again.
Okay, fellow in the white shirt, since I pointed you out before, then we'll go.
All right. Yeah, in the recent issue of Record Collector, you state that you've received a fan's bootleg record collection from a widow. Since you also state in that interview that nobody really saved anything, is there any chance of reaching out to fans for some of the stuff that you say has gone missing?
Well, I'm not sure that stuff's gone missing. You're quite right. That as I left, what's today, Friday. On Wednesday, I was in the office looking at this stuff that had arrived from Southampton, and it's extraordinary. There is so much stuff there, and I think he must have collected virtually every show we'd ever done and got the bootleg version. And I will listen to some of that. And I have to say, we've never had a proper fan club, and I think we always felt that it was something that we didn't particularly really want to do, and I think it was the right decision, because I think if you do have fan clubs, then you have to look after them properly, and we would never have done that, and so we're not very good like that. Short attention span. Great for 6 months, and then what should we do now? But there is a lot of stuff out there, and we have actually had help from various different people. There's a guy called Vernon Fitch, who runs the Pink Floyd archives. And I have to say, I do sometimes get onto Vernon and say, Vernon, you know, where were we then, and who did what, and who was that person, or whatever. So we are aware of fans and that they do have sometimes information or things that we don't. And I've been doing quite a lot of trying to find out what we've got in the way of film and video and so on in particular, rather than just music. And it's amazing what comes out of the woodwork. And, anyone in that sort of position, thank you very much.
Because Vernon and I went to college together. I think that's so funny.
Okay. Really?
Yeah, Michigan. Yeah, that's funny. Over here.
I was just wondering, when searching the archives for unreleased material for the new reissues that are coming out, did you come across any audio or video material from your North American tour of 1975 or your world tour of 1977?
Almost nothing. I mean, again, the problem is that the only times we really recorded properly with multi-track live was when we actually knew in advance we were going to put something out. And of course, something like the sort of Wish You Were Here tours, the 75 and the Animals tours, we were introducing the new studio album at the time, so it never occurred to us that we'd want to record, you know, make a live recording of it, because it was all sort of too new at the time. So that's, I think, why there just isn't anything from that period.
So nothing at all has come up at all?
Nothing at all.
Oh, that's disappointing.
Listen, I feel the same.
Why don't we get that fella in the back with the black shirt right there? Yeah, you. Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Scott Stevenson, and I wanted to ask you about that fictitious starts album. I love that project. Could you talk a little more about working with Carla Bley, and specifically about a hilarious song on that album I always love called Booty You Should?
The reason I ended up working with Carla was through Robert, because that was the big connection. Robert was the sort of the point of contact for all those sort of American jazz players, and it was through Robert I met Carla and Mike Mantler, and then Mike came to the UK. And he needed some help with an album he was making, and he wanted me to come in and help mix it. And so that was the sort of connection. And then what actually happened was that when we were doing whatever record deal, sort of re-signing with EMI sometime around the making of The Wall, the new contract gave us all the opportunity to make a solo record. And I had no intention of doing a real solo record, because there's a limit to how many people want to hear a 40-minute drum solo. And even I get bored with that. And so I really loved Carla's music, and so I talked to Mike and talked to Carla. And really, it's really a Carla Bley record, but sort of driven by me. And most of it, Robert was involved in it eventually. But there's a track, who's the girl? I'm trying to remember the girl who sings on it. There were some great players. Steve Swallow was an absolute joy to work with, who's the bass player who works regularly with them. And for me, again, it's this thing of, it's an education working with people like that, because they have a completely different way of working. I mean, working with Mike made me have to learn how to read a drum part, because the music is so complex some of the time that you can't remember it all, and you just need to be able to see it on paper and go, oh yeah, no, it's that.
Very good. How about you over there, Miss?
Hi.
Hi.
First, I want to express my honor because, I think Floyd has changed my life in a good way.
Good. Right. Always worried that maybe it changed it the wrong way.
I'm very, very happy to see you like personally. And I really want to ask about, can you tell some your personal experience from playing at the
Crazy stories. Beg your pardon. Well, the UFO Club was interesting and actually very sort of critical in our development. I get the impression a lot of you know my entire life story backwards anyway, so I'm not quite sure how much detail to go into. But when we started, we initially played at a place called Paris Gardens, but from that, we started to get a regular booking at this club called the UFO Club, which was the beginning of the sort of London Underground, the equivalent of Haight-Ashbury, and it was, for us, it was the real launch pad. You know, EMI heard about us playing at UFO. People came down to see us. Paul McCartney came to see us there, which was the sort of ultimate honour. And and it was interesting because it was not only a sort of music venue, I say venue, no, it wasn't only a music sort of occasion. It was all about this sort of idea. This was, so there'd be poetry readings, and there'd be some dances, and there'd be other things going on as well. And in a way, it was a wonderfully sort of naive at one level, because it was interesting how once all this new music that was coming out of this sort of this environment, and that's the soft machine, and then even the established bands suddenly started wearing William Morris print trousers and perming their hair and wearing beads and things. Suddenly, how that just swamped the whole thing and drove all the poets and dancers out. I mean, it was sort of brutal in a way, but it was a weekly. It was a club that only occurred on a Saturday night, only occurred after midnight because there was a cinema next door that couldn't tolerate loud music as an alternative soundtrack to whatever was playing. But it was quite special at the time, and the very first English light shows were there. It was developed by the people who were publishing the International Times, which was sort of.
Didn't I see there's a DVD, a movie called like the Dream, Technicolor Dream, or whatever like that? No, you were interviewed in it, right?
That was different. Yes, there was a film that was Let's Make Love in London. No, that was Tony Palmer, or maybe there was a film related to UFO. Was it Graham Whitehead? Peter Whitehead.
You got some fans here, dude.
Why doesn't someone else get up here and tell us all about it?
Okay.
But the Technicolor Dream was later. That was at Alexander Palace.
Yeah, because I know you were interviewed in it, and I think that it was about the International Times, so the fellow Hoppy, whatever the Keith.
Yeah,
okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Sorry. Over here, the fellow with the big stick, whatever that is. Just use the expression.
Here's someone whose life has changed in a bad way. Which is why he's waving the stick.
I think the song Point Me in the Sky is not as bad as Roger wants to say. It's one of the early good ones that never quite made it out. But the question I have, The Great Gig in the Sky, was that written for Claire Torrey, or was it written and then you were looking for a singer to try to fill that one? And one quick one, which is a yes or no, how did you come up with all those beds for a Momentary Lapse of Reason album? And who had time to put them on that beach?
I don't think a yes or no answer covers that one. That was definitely Storm who came up with that. And Storm is very good at finding very cheap assistants. Most of my children have worked for him at one time or another.
Not an optical illusion. Those are really all those beds on the beach.
Yeah, this is even then was before all that digital Photoshop.
Claire Torrey?
Claire Torrey. Well, the good news is that to some extent that question is answered with the new immersion version of Dark Side, because there's some tracks from 1972 played live, which include Great Gig without Claire and with a completely alternative part on top. And Claire was very much a sort of I won't say an afterthought, but it was very, very much part of the studio development of the record. And she was brought in by Alan Parsons as a suggestion. It was a pretty vague brief even by the time Claire arrived in the studio as to what we really wanted her to do and what we were trying to achieve. I mean, I think probably all of us had a slightly different view of what was going to go on it. And Alan got it right by bringing Claire in, who did really a definitive job on it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and then we'll move on. So this guy's got such a grin on his face. Okay, you're so eager. Please, ask your question.
Yeah, so when you were playing with the live Pink Floyd band, did you prefer playing with Gary Wallace or Willie Wilson?
Good question. They were so different. I mean, the stuff with Willie was the wall. So actually, we were playing a very, very specific part. The good thing about working with Gary is he's a very, very good player. And actually, I learned a lot from Gary. And whereas Willie was great to play with, he's a very good drummer, but Gary is technically is really something else.
Very good. Folks, thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to let you know that Nick will be outside signing his book and just, answering questions, I'm sure. And you can thank them yourself, but thank you very much for taking the time to come here.